So I'm going to practice another talk that I'm giving next week at the International Whitehead Conference, which this year is being called Seizing an Alternative Towards an Ecological Civilization. If you're actually going to be there next week, maybe don't listen to this now and just, well, at least if you're planning on visiting my track, just wait for me to present it then, because this is pretty much the final draft. I'm practicing it now for my own sake, and maybe hoping for some feedback from some of you who won't be making it to the conference, so that I can improve the final version that I do deliver next week. So the title of this talk is Whitehead's Non-Modern Philosophy, Cosmos and Polis in the Pluriverse. So this track has been given the task of reimagining late modernity, and in particular of reimagining what John Cobb Jr. has called late modernity's reductive monism. In my talk today, I want to try to sketch a cosmopolitical alternative to late modernity's reductive monism, as part of an attempt to begin preparing us, at least in the realm of ideas and imagination, for an ecological civilization to come. My approach will not be systematic, but pluralistic. I aim to sketch an alternative to modernity by drawing out the metaphysical possibilities opened up by ontological pluralism. My method is one of philosophical assemblage, which Whitehead suggests should precede the stage of careful systematization. Systems come later, after the owl of Minerva has flown, as Hegel once suggested, once we have had time for careful reflection about details. Right now, matters are rather urgent, and there is no time to fill in all the details. This is philosophy in a time of emergency. An old story is dying, and we need as many hints about the new one emerging as we can manage. And here an important difference between the Hegelian and the Whiteheadian method of philosophy becomes clear. Hegel says that philosophy's main task is to interpret the past, whereas Whitehead says philosophy's task is to imagine the future. It makes sense then that Hegel's approach would be systematic, whereas Whitehead's would be pluralistic. The future is open-ended, whereas the past has already happened, right? So it's my hope that a people to come will find more room to breathe in the processual pluriverse I'll attempt to sketch than modern people have found in their incoherently bifurcated and so alienating picture of a materialistic universe. So I'm building in this talk, of course, on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, who is the man of the hour, but also on that of William James, one of Whitehead's most important influences. And in addition, I'll build on the work of the contemporary French Whiteheadians, Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stengers. So let's begin by unpacking the title of this track a little bit. The track that I'm organizing, it's called Reimagining Late Modernity. So to better grasp the metaphysical underpinnings of late modernity, maybe it's best that we start by comparing it with early modernity. Early modernity was dualistic. On one side of the ontological divide were rational subjects who, by freely entering into a social contract, became citizens in a democratic state. On the other side were mechanical objects, which, by obeying universal causal laws, operated as part of a deterministic nature. So we have human society on one side and non-human nature on the other. Modernity thus began with a twin mission, what Latour refers to as the double task of emancipation and domination. The emancipatory task was political, to end exploitation of humans by humans. The task of domination was techno-scientific, to become masters and owners of nature. So, what happened? Why did late modernity become monistic, as Cobb describes it? Well, for one thing, the 19th century brought the discoveries of geological deep time, as well as evolutionary theory, both of which placed the human nature dualism of the 17th century on far shakier ground. Humanity, like all other organisms, must now be understood to be part of the same evolutionary process. A metaphysical decision was made in the 19th century to reduce human beings to one side of the former ontological dualism. And so we have increasingly been understood to be only a more sophisticated form of biological machine. Now, the alternative way of establishing this continuity between humans and the rest of nature would have been to reimagine nature as, in some sense, ensouled. And of course, that's exactly what uh, Whitehead's pluralistic panpsychism is an attempt to do. And even more important than the collapse of dualism into monism, of early modern dualism into late modern monism, however, was the 20th century failure of communism. What many would consider to be our greatest hope of ending exploitation of humans by humans was outlasted by capitalism, which has since given up on modernity's emancipatory mission and instead doubled down on domination. The failure of communism, neoliberal capitalists say, showed once and for all that human nature is basically selfish. Capitalists argue that domination and mastery of both human labor and natural resources through a kind of market monism is our only hope for a civilized existence. Only the invisible hand of the market, they say, can assure the stability of civilization. So everything from politics to religion to education to healthcare is said to be best given over to the free market, as though no other form of self-organization could help order our societies. Late modernity has transformed political science such that political actors are now understood to be economic consumers. Politicians are brands competing for the votes and the money of these consumers. Legislation is written on behalf of the highest bidder. The early modern values of liberal democracy have thus been replaced by the late modern values of the capitalist marketplace. With the failure of communism, the 20th century only led modernity to replace one war with another, the Cold War with the Warming War. Capitalism is no longer seriously threatened by any human, merely ideological enemy. Its only remaining adversary is Gaia. And the warming war here, of course, is the issue of global warming and climate change, which is, well, the terrifying face of Gaia intruding into human history. As Latour puts it, by seeking to orient man's exploitation of man toward an exploitation of nature by man, capitalism has magnified both beyond measure. Our situation as late modern people is stated starkly by Latour. He says that between modernizing, continuing to modernize, and ecologizing, we have to choose. Ecologizing our civilization is going to require reimagining the philosophical assumptions underlying the modern worldview. A philosophic outlook, writes Whitehead, is the very foundation of thought and of life. As we think, we live, he says. Now, I think I speak for all of us in this track, and perhaps for this entire conference, when I defend the simple thesis that ideas matter. Philosophy is not merely mental entertainment. On the contrary, it is a matter of life and of death. As Whitehead argues, the dominant philosophy of every age, quote, molds our type of civilization, end quote. Though a society's metaphysical assumptions may not be explicitly stated by every member, these assumptions are still operating all the more powerfully precisely because they are unconscious. Late modernity's market monism reduces our living planet to a resource and a trash bin, while early modern Cartesian dualism left no room for the concept of life. Late modern economonism, if you will, actively seeks to exterminate life, to convert it into capital. The currently unfolding mass extinction is not at all surprising as the outcome of modern philosophy. To Whitehead's statement linking thinking with living, we must add the corollary statement: as we think, we die. Human thinking is now recognized as a geological force. We are entering the Anthropocene. Our collective decisions today will shape the Earth community for millions of years. Both dualism and monism have failed us, failed our civilization, and failed the Earth. At this point, as Latour puts it, and I quote, "We have to fight trouble with trouble, counter a metaphysical machine with a bigger metaphysical machine." End quote. Hence, my attempt to construct an alternative, pluralistic, ontology, a pluralistic ontology, to counter modern philosophies, early modern dualism and late modern monism. Ontological pluralism is easy to define, but it's not as easy to understand. It is the metaphysical position which suggests that there are more than one, or two, or three, or any finite number of ways of being. Reality is the ongoing composition of a multiplicity of more or less overlapping and interpenetrating modes of existence. We are so used to thinking of reality being unified, a finished one, that the possibility of its becoming many may at first seem like a terrifying prospect. To the extent that modern inheritors of the liberal tradition, the tradition of Locke, to the extent that they really understand its implications, pluralism should be terrifying, since it dissolves all of our hubristic certainties about ourselves and the world, about who and where we think we are. Part of the rationale behind the modern bifurcation of nature is that defining nature or matter as inert, dead stuff helped humans to establish our own identity as free agents. To challenge the inertness of nature, to recognize its agency, is also to challenge liberal notions of individual human freedom. Challenging these notions does not mean dismissing them. We are agents too, after all. But it does mean reimagining the very foundations of individual identity and social contract-based politics. There are less radical forms of pluralism, like cultural relativism and worldview pluralism. Everybody knows there are other ways of knowing, other cultural practices with their own psychological and even perceptual ways of representing reality. Moderns accept that there are multiple views of the world. But what no modern person doubts is that one world underlies all the views that humans can have of it. Many views, one world, in other words. Many cultures, one nature. Ontological pluralism is not multiculturalism, but multinaturalism. Multiculturalism, as Latour points out, is only the flip side of mononaturalism. Modern Western people have, for a few hundred years, thought of themselves as only a half-culture, since, unlike all other earthly peoples, they were also the practitioners of something called science, with a capital S, the faithful servants of something called reason, again with a capital R. Their capital S science and capital R reason, so the story goes, granted them access to an objective and universal nature, an external world out there that for so much of human history had remained buried beneath cultural projections and superstitions. Moderns sent their anthropologists to study exotic peoples in faraway lands, always assuming that no matter how different those people appeared at first glance, beneath the surface the same universal laws belonging to the same physical nature must be governing their behaviors. The same gravitational energy must be keeping their feet on the ground, the same genes building their cells, the same neurons secreting their belief systems. Yes, we Westerners also have our subjective quirks, our psychological complexes and superstitions, but still, only we had the good fortune to have discovered a way to uncover nature, to put aside our cultural idiosyncrasies, at least when we donned a white lab coat and entered the laboratory, so as to reach naked and indisputable matters of fact. It then became our sacred duty to educate others about the one true world. Prior to modern European science, medieval European religion had attempted something similar. There was one God, one final divine arbiter who decided what was good and true for everyone. For modern scientific people, the one major difference is that the one unified nature is understood to be entirely disenchanted and meaningless. Latour describes the paradox, and I quote, "Modernization compelled one to mourn the passing of all one's colorful pretensions, one's motley cosmologies, of all the many ways of life with their rich rituals. Let us wipe away our tears," the modernists like to declare. "Let us become adults at last. Humanity is leaving behind its myth-imbued childhood and is stepping into the harsh reality of science, technology, and the market." It is a pity, Latour continues, but that is the way it is. You can either choose to cling to your diverse cultures and conflicts will not cease, or, alternatively, you can accept unity as the sharing of a common world, and then, naturally, in every sense of the word, this world will be devoid of meaning. Too bad. Love it or leave it. End quote. This is the crazy-making double bind of modern existence. Liberation from cultural conflict comes only through materialistic science, and yet the unified nature this science is supposed to liberate us into is said to be absolutely meaningless. Whitehead's self-entitled philosophy of organism, or ontology of organism, provides us with an example of a fully ecologized philosophy. Multinaturalism means neither science nor the universe it purports to study are ready-made, unified, and finished wholes. There are as many sciences as there are natures. This does not mean that scientific knowledge is no better than opinion, or that all truth is relative. On the contrary, science has proven to be among the most powerful methods humans have ever invented of coming into more intimate relationship with the plurality of nature. In regard to knowledge, ontological pluralism does not imply the relativity of truth, but the truth of relativity. Knowledge, like reality, is relational. Further, such pluralism is not the denial of wholeness. Rather, if wholes are to exist, they must first be constructed and thereafter constantly maintained. Ontological pluralism only claims that unity does not exist in advance of such composition. If any science qualifies as the science of wholes, and in a pluralist ontology there are many wholes, not just one, if any science does qualify as the science of wholes, it is ecology, which traditionally has been defined as the study of the relationship between organisms and environments. But in Whitehead's scheme, the concept of an environment cannot just be taken for granted as a fixed and inorganic background. The environment is not, as Latour put it in his Gifford lectures on Gaia, a mere frame devoid of any agency. There is no environment. There are only ever communities of other organisms. In an ontology of organism, physics and chemistry are no longer considered to be descriptions of the meaningless motion of molecules, to which biology is ultimately reducible, but rather themselves become studies of self-organization at ecological scales other than the biological. In other words, in a pluralistic ontology, ecology replaces physics as the foundational science. A pluralistic ontology of organism opens us to the possibility of cosmopolitics, a concept originally developed by Isabel Stengers. Cosmopolitics has been articulated as a protest against what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature, that is, the splitting off of human consciousness and values from everything physical and factual. We are left by this all too modern predicament, Whitehead tells us, having to somehow reconcile the dream of our common sense experience of an apparently meaningful world with the scientific conjecture of a mind-independent and so meaningless reality. Now, ontological pluralism, unlike modern dualistic and materialistic metaphysical schemes, rejects this division of appearance and reality, or of experience, and nature, and instead suggests a panpsychic vision of things. Everything perceived is in nature, and everything in nature perceives. There is no bifurcation. To speak crudely, mind belongs to nature, is intrinsic to it. For this reason, Whitehead's ontology has been referred to as an aesthetic ontology. What begins as appearance later becomes reality, and the best example of this in the biological world is through sexual selection. Those appearances which are desirable eventually become physiological realities, right? That's how sexual selection and the evolutionary process unfolds, and Whitehead generalizes this notion into an ontology of organism. So it doesn't just apply in biology anymore. For Whitehead, reality is literally composed of feelings and desires, or what Whitehead calls prehensions. Right? So appearance and reality are reciprocally constituting mutually causal notions. They're not opposed to one another. So Whitehead's cosmopolitical protest against the bifurcation of nature not only provides us with a defense of democratic politics against economonism, it is itself a democratic ontology. That is, not just a democratic view of human society, but a democratic view of nature. Whitehead says, in Process and Reality, quote, "We find ourselves in a buzzing world, amid a democracy of fellow creatures." Whitehead here alludes to perhaps his most significant influence, William James, who famously referred to the experience of pre-egoic infants as a great blooming, buzzing confusion. In A Pluralistic Universe, James, one of the last lectures that James delivered before his death a year later, he suggested that, quote, "The common socius of us all is the great universe whose children we are." Cosmopolitics then calls upon us to recognize that the polis, the city, is not just built by and for us, on the planet, passive before our projects. We must wake up from the nightmare of bifurcation to our roles as creaturely citizens of an earth community. If modernity has culminated in the bifurcation of mono-naturalist science from multiculturalist politics, then the emergence of a non-modern ecological civilization will require the reinvention of both. Not only must ecology replace physics as the foundation of the natural sciences, it must replace economics as the foundation of the social sciences as well. Cosmopolitics is an attempt to do just that, to reimagine scientific practices in more democratic terms, and to reimagine politics in a way that acknowledges the need to invent ways of coexisting, not just with people of our own color, country, or culture, not even with just other humans, but with all Earth's creatures. To democratize science doesn't mean facts should be determined by popular opinion. Rather, it means recognizing that scientific activity is always undertaken upon a landscape shaped by socioeconomic interests and is always fraught with political implications. Knowledge is an ecological affair, an ongoing and risky process of building alliances and relationships between humans and non-humans across wide distances. It is not, despite modern epistemic pretenses, the product of an objectifying gaze from nowhere. Stengers points out the tendency many modern scientists and technologists have to, quote, defer to politics, decisions that would have to be made about the use of data and techniques produced in the laboratory, thereby washing their hands of the merely social or ethical implications of their purely factual findings or technological inventions. I can offer a personal example here of when I was an undergraduate at the University of Central Florida, and I was majoring in philosophy and cognitive science. The engineering department invited the computer scientist Marvin Minsky to come talk about the book he was writing at the time, called The Emotion Machine, and he basically argued that he was going to be able to devise a unique algorithm that would grant machines the capacity to feel emotion, so that they would, for all intents and purposes, be just like any human being, and be able to think about the nature of the world and other beings just like we do. So, assuming for a minute that his emotion machine is possible, which I have many doubts about, I asked him afterwards, so, let's say you do create this machine, are we going to pay it for the work that it does? Are we going to let it vote? Does it have rights? And his answer was very quick and to the point. He said, I'm a scientist, and that's a political question. Let's let the politicians worry about that. And I think for obvious reasons, this is a problem. Scientists cannot pretend that what they do is immune to political and social influences and implications. We need to recognize the way that science and politics interact. Otherwise we're going to keep inventing atom bombs, and the military-industrial complex is going to continue to co-opt science and technology for its own purposes. So whereas early modern dualism and late modern monism alike produced and empowered expert scientists who claim to have unmasked with objective certainty a truth hidden from common sense experience, pluralism is an intrinsically diplomatic ontology. The pluralist responds to encounters with others under the assumption that reality is an ongoing and open-ended geostorical adventure, as Latour refers to it, of planetary negotiation, which is to say that truth is always in the making and never at rest in the possession of an isolated heroic knower. The ontological pluralist doesn't falsely align fetishized notions of science, rationality, and objectivity on one side and oppose them to belief, custom, and illusion on the other. Instead of in every case sending in the experts to tell local populations how to solve their problems, assuming in advance that scientific knowledge is universal and that only science has the right to produce such knowledge, instead every issue is approached diplomatically under the very different assumption that knowledge is relational, its claims conditional, and its construction risky. Further, cosmopolitics is not cosmopolitanism, is not rooted in the search for some abstract sense of universal humanity. The notion of human rights may have functioned in a liberatory way in some cases, but just as often, argue Stengers, it has served as a way of disqualifying those whose unique ways of life fail to fit the universal mold. Stengers criticizes this modern attempt to politically unify all peoples through an all too abstract notion of humanity. Such an attempt moves too fast, pretending to achieve in advance what can only be accomplished at the end, after much negotiation. As Latour puts it, and I quote, "Unity has to be the end result of a diplomatic effort. It cannot be its uncontroversial starting point." End quote. Stengers links the Fales notion of human rights to the curse of tolerance. The idea that so long as you keep your differences private, we can learn to live together in public. In other words, so long as you don't take your own cosmology seriously and are willing to accept the strange mono-naturalist, multiculturalist double bind of modernity, then we can tolerate one another's abstract right to exist. So long, of course, as you stay over there in your own neighborhood and don't force me to deal with the dissonance of such a strangely bifurcated image of reality too directly. For this all too abstract form of peace would quickly dissolve if we concretely encountered one another's differences. And indeed, I think our contemporary society is evidence of what happens when we fail to keep in our own separate neighborhoods. If there is to be a future cosmopolitical civilization, It will no longer accept the dichotomy between public and private life. We will have to uh, find a way to meet the challenge of inventing a means of living together within the same extended community. We will all have become diplomats, willing to exist in the tension-filled space between worlds, to accept that our own identities are always risked in encounters with others, acknowledging that our own world must be unfinished so long as it leaves others outside it. So then, what is the take-home of this assemblage of non-modern Whiteheadian philosophical ideas? What is the relationship between Whitehead's metaphysical scheme and the ecologization of our species and of our civilization? How can we help to transform our cities from gas-guzzling machines into creative contributors to life's flourishing? How are we to convert Whitehead's cosmological theory into a cultural and political practice that leads us home again, that allows us to remember that we are primarily earthbound creatures and not biological machines or economic consumers? What I have tried to suggest is that Whitehead's speculative cosmovision evokes an alternative form of consciousness, provoking a reimagination of the modern bifurcation between subjectivity and objectivity. Whitehead's philosophy heralds the transformation of the American dream of private human subjectivity with ownership over private natural property into the dream of the earth, as Thomas Berry calls it. Whitehead's words work upon our souls like alchemical catalysts. His books are a psychedelic pharmacopoeia, a remedy for sick minds. He is a philosophical diplomat. He heals the divisions of our intellectual histories, not by rushing to unify them into a single system, but by giving each perspective, each contrast, its place in an organic community of interrelationship, which somehow manages to hang together as a whole, not by necessity, by right, or by divine fiat, but because of the persuasive allure of beauty, freely calling all creatures toward harmony and order, toward cosmos rather than chaos. The natural world, the universe, the cosmos, nature, etc., is not something we can continue to imagine as apart from, as other than the human world, the polis, society. The cosmos is just as political as we are, just as much a society of agents vying with one another for power, for access to energy, to food, to sex, to status and attention. We may be among the most creative and spiritual beings to have evolved in this cosmos, but we are also earthbound creatures. Realistically speaking, the only way our species can leave the planet Earth is by going extinct. There is no other Earth that can sustain us.